So in the book of Esther, we started in chapter 1, and that was the foundation. And in Esther, we realized that we were talking about King Ahasuerus, and he was the king of the kingdom of Persia, and his capital was found in the city of Susa. So a lot of the events take place in the citadel of Susa. We established the time period was at the beginning of his reign, so that would have been somewhere between 484 and 481 BCE. So we know the who, we know the where, and we know the time period, and all of that was given to us. The other thing that we looked at was that he was in that time period preparing to go to war against the Greeks. And that gave us an understanding of why there was the banquet that lasted for 6 months and then finished with the 7-week banquet. All of that was in his preparation to get the kingdom ready to go to war. So having that understanding helped us have a view of the book of Esther and just the kingdom and where we were in his time of reign. The end of that chapter was where we had the conflict, you might say, of Queen Vashti, as she was asked to come forward and she did not. And so that was the first irrevocable edict that was put out so that we would know that the position of queen had been vacated and why it had been vacated. I think it was also to give us a heads up about the very fact that edicts issued in this kingdom were irrevocable. They could not be changed. So we don't just have the one that came later, or actually the 2 that came later. We started with that one to have an understanding. Then we moved into chapter 2. And because this is a narrative and a story with the flow in chapter 2, we were introduced to the next characters, which were Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai being the adopted father of Esther. Also, he was a cousin. So he was a blood relation to Esther, and we know the relationship that they shared. At the end of chapter 2, just like at the end of chapter 1, it almost seems like this secondary, notification is given to us about something that's significant, but we're not giving a lot of detail in it. And that would be that Mordecai finds out about a plot to kill King Ahasuerus, and he communicates through Esther to the king and saves the king's life. Then in chapter 3, again, as a story narrative, we're introduced to the villain, and that would be Haman. So in chapter 3, we find out about Haman and that he is identified as an enemy of the Jews. So he's been elevated to a high position in the kingdom. We are not told why he was elevated, but we know he is an enemy of the Jew. And his desire is specifically to annihilate the Jews. The word we have in our vernacular would be genocide was his desire. He wanted to eliminate them as a people completely. In chapter 4, we have the response that comes because what he did was put an edict in place in chapter 3. Again, an edict that could not be reversed. He basically bought the Jewish people, cast lots to determine the day this extermination would take place, and put it in an edict, and it went out to the kingdom. In chapter 4, we have Mordecai's response to the edict. So we have the lamentation, we have his mourning, we have him approaching Esther, communication between Esther and Mordecai, with the conclusion that she decides that she is going to go before the king to put forward her request to save her people. That is the focus. In chapter 5, the king receives Esther to his court, and we had the whole build up to that. And for those of you who've seen the movies, that's the big moment when she's dressed in her garb and she goes into the court, and that's the big event that the movies tend to focus on. She desires to be honored by the king and to honor the king, while Haman's focus is on the destruction of Mordecai. So we find Esther wanting to save the Jews, and we have an underlying conflict between the two as Haman moves forward wanting to destroy the Jews. In particular, Haman is offended, and he doesn't want to wait for the edict to take place. He decides he wants to go after Mordecai now. Now again, all of that pulls into the providence of God, because if that had not occurred, we don't know how the story would have ended. We don't know what God would have done, but we did talk about the fact God would have saved his people. But this event, this anger of Haman, is what God used in order to bring about the way he saved his people. Then in chapter 6, we had the beginning of this turning of the narrative where Haman's plot is reversed, and instead of he being honored, he's forced to be the one to honor Mordecai. And then in chapter 7, Esther has revealed to King Ahasuerus Haman's plan to exterminate the Jews, and he's ultimately hanged on the gallows that he had made for Mordecai. I loved looking at all the irony, and this was planned that way, then God used it and took it a different direction. It was wonderful. Then we did chapter 8 last week, and in 8, we had Mordecai replacing Haman in his position, serving the king, and becoming a manager of the home that had been given to Esther by the king. And remember, home wasn't just a house, it represented a position within the kingdom. And we did a comparison where whoever resides in our White House is there, but it comes with a position as well. The king cannot revoke Haman's edict as Esther requests him to do. So then Mordecai writes a new edict for the defense of the Jews. So that was the story, right? The back and forth, the roller coaster that we've been on, that is the book of Esther. And so now we're going to step into chapter 9, and we'll do the first 4 verses in chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. Even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews, because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. So verse 1 unfolds identifying the time as happening in the 12th month called Adar on the 13th day. This was the day clearly defined, and it was described as the king's command as the day of action in the edicts, both edicts. This is an important day. The plan for the enemies of the Jews was to gain mastery over them. That's a fancy way of saying they had wanted to destroy them. Or as Haman's edict had endorsed, it was to kill the Jews and to take their plunder. So we had the incentive there as well. The overview of verse 1 says the opposite happened, and that the Jews were victorious over those who hated them. So it's kind of like a spoiler alert. You know, you get your overview in one verse of what the conclusion was. This was the desire of the enemies, and yet we are going to tell you up front that the Jews won instead. Now we get the details that come under that. So in verse 2, it details how the victory was achieved, recording how the Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. The Jews were specifically gathering to defend themselves from those who sought to harm them. This might indicate that the Jews living outside the cities with the Jews gathered with the Jews that were inside the cities as a form of support and help. You wouldn't want to be a Jew outside on the farmland if you've got armies that are coming to kill. So it would seem to me that the Jews that were outside the protection of cities gathered within their closest city with their city-dwelling brethren to be in defense of the attacking armies. That's why I would make that conclusion. As the Jews gathered together, the description is there was no one that could stand before them. So the reason for the outcome for the Jews is because the dread of the Jews had fallen on all the peoples. And we had looked at other scriptures to talk about the fact that this was something that permeated the people. This was from previous potential stories of the Exodus and what happened with Egypt. This was, obviously the talk would be going around town about what happened to Haman. There's a lot of reasons for it, but the communication went out and the people had a dread of the Jews. Now that sounds interesting because there's still those that are going to come against them, but the majority seem to have that dread of the Jews and not wanting to stand up against them. In verse 3, it describes support for the Jews coming from, listen to that, all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business, assisted the Jews. This would mean at every local government level, the governments were there and wanting to help protect the Jews. So those that are coming after the Jews are not represented by the local governances. They would be rebel groups. They would have their leadership outside of those that were recognized by the king. And that verse clearly gives us that indication. These leaders supported the Jews because they were afraid not to support Mordecai, as they now feared Mordecai. Sometimes to be a good leader, you need to be feared. And Mordecai is feared. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. The stories would get out about what happened to those that came against him. So it's their own superstition that may be the support of their fear. Knowing that Haman specifically was coming after them, and what happened to Haman, Mordecai wasn't in charge of that, but his God was. But Mordecai was still the physical representation of a person here on earth in a position that it's clear God is protecting. And so the fear of Mordecai goes out amongst the leaders, and they then support the Jews. In verse 4, it explains why these leaders have come to fear Mordecai, as he was great in the king's house. His fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. This is a testament to Mordecai's, I would say, character, his honesty, his leadership, all the things that were needed. The king had raised him up and he met the challenge. And there are people that notice this, and is recorded in scripture for us that he met that challenge well. It has been 9 months since the edict was issued by Mordecai directing the defense of the Jews to occur on the 13th of Adar. Mordecai appears to have done the work of his position before the king, gathering notoriety with those who are in the positions of power. Again, this is like looking back at the details, and we're getting an overview. That was verse 1, and now we're going into some more detail. But all of this is looking back at how things had happened within this kingdom. So now we'll do 9 verses 5 through 11. So Esther 9, we'll start in 5 and we'll go through 11. Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And Pashantatha, Dalphon, Asparatha, Poratha, Adelia, Aridatha, Parmashtha, Arisia, Aridia, and Vasiliah, the 10 sons of Haman, the Hammedathite, the Jews' enemy. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel of Susa was reported to the king. Again, for those of you looking for unique names, there's another list for you if you want to step up. Verse 5. In verse 5, it details that on the day that's defined again by both edicts, the Jews throughout the kingdom struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying. And they did what they pleased to those who hated them. Remember, that's the underlying thing to realize. There's been an edict that's been sent out that the Jews can defend themselves. And yet there are those with hardened hearts, with such hatred that they don't care. They are still going to try to kill the Jews, as many as they can. They're still willing to attack this people. There were those in the kingdom who had determined to seek this out. It does not end well for the enemy of the Jews. Verse 6 clarifies specifically that at the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. In verses 7 through 9, it adds these 10 individuals by name who were killed. I will not repeat the names, but they will be in your notes. In verse 10, it informs us that these were the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy. So the crab tree, or the crab apple did not fall far from the crab tree in this case. They also continued with the hatred of the Jews. The Jews did not lay their hands on the plunder. There would have been significant plunder, as Haman had been a very wealthy individual, and by extension, his sons may very well have inherited much of his wealth when he was hanged on the gallows by King Ahasuerus. So we don't know where Haman's wealth went. We said there was a potential when the house of Haman was given to Esther, there may have been financial things of Haman's estate that were given to take care of the estate, but we don't know that. But we know that Haman was probably one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire kingdom, so it would make sense that his sons also were wealthy. And the Jews, even though they killed them, do not take the plunder. So that would underscore yet again, there was plunder to be taken. The reason this continues to be highlighted for us is that there was no financial incentive to be obtained by the Jews in their actions against their enemies. Only self-preservation. They didn't want anything that could be linked that could say, oh yeah, you say you did it, to save yourself, but then you helped yourself to this and that, so you were doing it for the wrong motive. So they eliminate the opportunity for another motive to be identified by not taking the plunder, and that's why that's important. In verse 11, the king receives a report of the number of those that were killed in Susa, and that number was 500. So now we'll do chapter 9, we'll do verses 12 through 19. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your further request? It shall be done. Then said Esther, if it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa, to do according to the edict of today. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and kill 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. So in verse 12, the king identifies he knew about the 500 men that had been killed and about the 10 sons of Haman killed in the citadel of Susa. And now he wants to know what has happened in the rest of the kingdom. Seems like now King Ahasuerus is a little more, questioning about what's going on in his kingdom. He wants a little feedback now. Before the king receives the report of the impact, because of course, they didn't have telegraphs back then, right? So he's not going to find out the answer to that question for some time, but he asks the question nonetheless. He asked what Esther's petition would be now. So without knowing what's happened in the rest of the kingdom, he asked Esther, what else can I do for you? And King Ahasuerus adds, again, what? Your petition will be granted. He says it to her prior to her making the request. And that ties back to the wording that we looked at earlier when she approached the king and he talked about giving her up to half the kingdom. This is the same thing. It had that meaning already. In verse 13, it details Esther's request. If it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So Esther wishes to complete the job in the capital of Susa by removing anyone who desired to kill the Jews. This day was not given in the original edict from Haman to attack the Jews, but Esther is requesting this additional day to finish removing the enemies of the Jews that were still in Susa. Now remember, Susa is the capital. This would be if you were going to do a coup, where you would go. This is where a lot of representation takes place for the kingdom. And that is why the enemies of the Jews were so numerous there. An interesting thing is quoted here, and some people are confused by it when it says that King Ahasuerus then had the 10 sons hanged, because they're like, wait a minute, we just heard they were killed the day before. Esther wants the bodies of Haman's dead sons displayed on the gallows as a warning to anyone who would think they could come against the Jews in the future. The second reason to have the 10 sons visible may be to demonstrate those who led the attacks against the Jews were dead. So these 10 men may have very well been the power behind the continuation to desire to create the havoc and attack the Jews. So it could be twofold. One, obviously, just like when Haman was hanged, it was to send a message as to what happens to those that would come against the Jews. So it clearly has that representation. But it may be, if your leader's dead, you should probably stop the fight that you're on. So it could have that second meaning. The scriptures don't give that one. I give that one to you free. That's extra for Annette to give you. When the number 10 is used in the scriptures, it signifies a testimony or a witness of something. So the number 10, when you find it associated with anything in the Bible, it will always be a witness or a testimony to something. A few examples to give to you would include the 10 Commandments, God's witness and testimony to man of sin, the 10 plagues of Egypt, the 10 elders that are called by Boaz to be his witness at the gate, the 10 days of testing for Daniel and his friends. The prophetic book gives us 10 kings or 10 diadems or 10 horns. Those are all of prophetic events to occur in the future. It will be a witness. It will be a testimony. There's plenty of parables that include the 10 virgins, the 10 talents, the 10 silver coins, the 10 slaves with the 10 minas ruling over 10 cities, the 10 lepers that were healed, and there were others. But that's the list that you'll get in the notes as a reminder that the number 10 represents a witness and a testimony of something. So the 10 sons of Haman were hanged during the 13th of Adar, and now Esther's desire is to have the bodies hanged as a testimony of what happens to those who come against the Jews. Verse 14. It clarifies that the king commanded with an edict in Susa that Haman's 10 sons were to be hanged. She got permission. She didn't just have it done. She comes before the king. She shows her submitted nature to the king by asking permission before doing such, I wouldn't say grievous, but isn't it kind of horrendous to think about that event? 10 gallows had to be constructed. 10 men that were known throughout probably the city of Susa in particular. Their bodies are impaled and put up for the city to see. That's a pretty gruesome testimony. So Esther gets permission. In verse 15, the Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Susa. Again, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Susa was the capital and the seat of government in the Persian Empire. There may have been more enemies gathered here at this time. This was a power struggle. Because remember, Haman's been removed and Mordecai was put in the place of Haman. Not everybody was joyous about that change of leadership. So that may be another reason that you see so many gathered in Susa. They still had a desire to take down Mordecai. They didn't like that he was in a position of second in command under the king. There is a specific reference to the Jews not laying their hands on the plunder. This would be an expected outcome in this day and age for the victor. And this would have been a positive impression on those who took notice of how the Jews were different in this situation. The Jews were not acting with any monetary incentive, only defending themselves from their enemies. In verse 16, it details that outside of Susa, in the king's provinces, the Jews had assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies. The Jews killed 75,000 of those who hated them. It is repeated here that the Jews did not take any plunder. The Jews' enemies were still focused on their destruction and had still gathered to attack them. The influence of Haman's sons may have been the organizers behind this action. The number 75,000 seems to be large, but remember, the Persian Empire was a vast empire of 127 provinces. So if there were enemies in all of the provinces, there would be about 600 per province. And it's doubtful that all the provinces were of the same size or that the numbers were equally distributed. The Jews again did not take plunder, which would be the normal outcome of such an event, and that detail is important. This is the testimony of the Jews to those in the kingdom. In verse 17, it identifies the 75,000 men attacked the Jews on the 13th day. Did I just read that? No, and on the 14th day, that is the day the Jews defended themselves. After the day of defeat of the enemies, on the 14th day, they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. In verse 18, based on the king's command, the Jews were in Susa assembled on the 13th and 14th day of the same month. They did not rest until the 15th day, and they made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Verse 19 indicates this is why the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month, Adar, a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. So now you're getting the next layer. You're getting the foundation for what is going to be proposed as a perpetual celebration of Purim. This day was a day of rejoicing versus what could have been a day of sorrow and mourning. This day was to be celebrated with feasting versus what could have been fasting. This day there was to be sharing portions of food with each other versus having everything taken away as plunder. We move to verse 20, and we'll do verses 20 through 22. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually. Because of those days, on those days, the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which turned for them from sorrow to gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So in verse 20, the commemorization of these events is secured by Mordecai as he sent letters to the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. We are noted both near and far. All of the kingdoms, all the letters go out yet again to inform why this is to happen. In verse 21, it clarifies that Mordecai's desire for the Jews to what they're to do is obliging them to celebrate it on the 14th of the month and the 15th of the same month annually. So he's establishing this. So this didn't just happen. We weren't just all happy and everybody decided to celebrate. He's giving it a formal structure as to how it's to be celebrated, when it's to be celebrated, why it's to be celebrated. In verse 2, the reason for the annual celebration was because, and on those days, the Jews rid themselves of their enemies. This was a time which turned for the Jews from sorrow to gladness and from mourning to holiday. Remember that when you see the celebration, it's a celebration of the fact it could have been otherwise. This is a remembrance of that. Because the Jews experienced gladness, they were to make these days of feasting and rejoicing and send portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Gifts to the poor may be a way to help everyone have the opportunity to celebrate, even those who could not otherwise afford to participate in the celebration. All Jews are to celebrate. So you don't leave anybody out because maybe they can't afford to participate. So that may be one of the reasons that that was included. So now Esther 9, verses 23 through 32. Thus the Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written for them. For Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme which he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the name of the pur. And because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants, and for all those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions for their times of fasting and their lamentations. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. Lots of review, lots of repeats here, but in verse 23, it is the beginning of this overview of what is taking place, including answering questions for those who may not be familiar with the details of the events. So he wants to fill in all the questions, fill in the blanks so that all the questions are answered. The first thing of importance to establish, the Jews completed what they had started, removing the enemies of the Jews. Their actions were justified as they responded within the edict given by Mordecai. So they were not rebels in their standing up against those who came to attack them, as they might have been accused by some of those of the day or of a later day. So that's why it's repeated. They did exactly what they were supposed to do, what they were allowed to do, what they were commanded to do on the days that they were allowed to do it. In verse 24, the justification for the edict to be written by Mordecai, as well as the need for the destruction of the Jews' enemy, is established. First, it is established that Haman is an Agagite and an adversary to the Jews. Secondly, he schemed against the Jews with the goal of destroying them. Finally, Haman had utilized the casting of lots, referred to as pur, in his desire to destroy them. The casting of lots had determined the day of the destruction, when it was to be carried out. And we talked about that when we discussed it in the chapter earlier in Esther. This day the enemy believed was chosen with the aid of supernatural entities in casting of the lots. The enemy does not comprehend the sovereign control of all events established by God. I give you a verse reference here in Proverbs. So Proverbs 16:33. Proverbs 16:33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." There is nothing outside of his sovereign control, and his word gives us the verification of that. God is in control of every decision and every event. Verse 25. It's a high-level overview of what the king's part in the decisions were. Notice the king is never, as we would say, thrown under the bus in any of this. So we now have a review from the king's perspective. First is a clarification that the king had not been aware of what Haman was planning to carry out against the Jews. So for those that would want to point fingers, he should have asked, whatever, you can go there, but the scriptures give the verification. He did not know that this is what was being planned for the Jews. The king then commanded in a letter written by Mordecai to reverse the intention of Haman's edict. This was still seen as a command of the king, even though it was given to Mordecai and Esther to carry out the details to the writing and how it was going to work out and the strategies. But the king is still seen here as giving the command. He's given credit, basically, in history for allowing the protection of the Jews. The king was responsible for Haman being hanged on the gallows. The king was responsible for Haman's sons' bodies being hanged on the gallows. All of this is to underscore the king was part of what is happening in protection of the Jews. This is also a demonstration of what God had spoken to Abraham back in Genesis 12:13. So Genesis 12:13. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Those who would bless the Jewish nation would be blessed, and those who would curse the nation would be cursed. God said that in Genesis. I don't have time to do a history lesson here of all the times that this is played out in history. But right here in the book of Esther is the only example for today for us to see that very promise of God given to Abraham back in Genesis being carried out in the life of Mordecai and Esther and in the Persian kingdom. So back to Esther chapter 9, verse 26. The name given to these days because of what happened and witnessed by the Jews of that time was Purim, taken from the name Pur. Verse 27 establishes this custom was for the Jews who had experienced the miracle of having been saved from their enemies. It was also to be celebrated in 2 days by their descendants for future generations to be reminded of this miracle from God. It was for the Gentiles who had joined the Jews in defending them with their enemies. It was a celebration that was to be remembered every year moving forward in the future. It was never to be forgotten. In verse 28, again, it establishes these days were for a remembrance and a celebration for every generation so that it would not fade from their memory. In verse 29, the letter establishes the celebration and giving the reason for the celebration, and it was done by Queen Esther and Mordecai. So we're looking at the authors. In verse 30, the letters are described as words of peace and truth, sent to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus. The purpose of the letter defined in verse 31 was to first establish the days of Purim at their appointed times, using what Mordecai and Esther had established, and then shared with their descendants, including when they had fasted and their lamentations. It's a way of bringing the story of what occurred into a story form and a narrative that will be shared perpetually with the generations of the Jews. It is not to be forgotten. But notice in verse 30, I love that it highlights it was done for the purpose, the words were of peace and truth. Not, hey, look what we did. Not, hey, look how many horrible enemies are out there. It's simply a reflection of God's sovereign will acted out in this people's life, this people's history, and this is to be shared in peace and truth. In verse 32, the command to establish the customs for Purim is credited to Esther. This was recorded in the book. There is no definition of the book for us to know what book is being referred to here. I do love that. This is a party and Esther gets credit for making it happen. Chapter 9 is the overview of the impact of these events on the Jews and the establishment of Purim. This was of significant importance, as this was the first time that a feast is to be celebrated in mess that word up. I knew when I typed it. Perpetuity for the Jews was being established for them outside the Torah. That had never happened before. This was a first. That's why you see chapter 9 repeating over and over. This was established. This was the date it was established. This was the reason it was established. It's to be true. It's to be of peace. It's to be all of it. You're like, all right, we get it already. Why do you keep repeating? This is why it's repeated. They put it out there. They give the overview. They got the king's approval. Mordecai and Esther were behind it. Esther was the author. These are all the reasons this is being done, because there would have been those, I know this is hard to believe, there would have been those, even within the Jewish community, holding on to their legalism that said, well, it wasn't established in the Torah. I'm not going to celebrate that day. It's not in Torah. We're not doing it. So even back then, you have this repeat in chapter 9, and that's the reason behind it, because this is going to be established as a celebration for the Jews as a people, as a nation, to be carried out into the future. It was a big deal. It wasn't something small. And do the Jews still celebrate it today? Yes. Were they successful? Yes. So now we end with the big chapter, chapter 10. We have 3 verses. So 3 verses in chapter 10. Now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlines of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. So chapter 10 gives an overview of how the events impacted the non-Jews in the kingdom. In verse 1, King Ahasuerus requires a tribute or a tax to be collected. In verse 2, King Ahasuerus receives credit for the accomplishments of Mordecai, as he was the one who advanced him to a great position in the kingdom. The list of the accomplishments were written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. Remember, this kingdom was known for recording every noteworthy event of their activities, and the scriptures had confirmed this narrative would have been included in their pages of their history. In verse 3, that we are reminded that Mordecai was second in command of the king of Ahasuerus, in case there was anybody who didn't get exactly how high Mordecai had risen in the king's service. Mordecai was seen as great among Jews and seen to have a good light by his kinsmen. He's liked by his kinsmen. Finally, the legacy of Mordecai is that he sought the good of the Jews, and he cared about all the people of the entire kingdom. The book of Esther is the sole reason for the celebration known as Purim. One of the traditions during the celebration of Purim is to read the entire book of Esther. Some in home celebrations, others in celebrations in a more public setting like a synagogue. The book of Esther is one of the 5 scrolls in what's called the, I don't know how to say that exactly, Megillah? Is that how you say that? Helen, tell me how to say that. Megillah, thank you. I'm sure I've butchered so many words, but Megillah, I now know is the right way. It's found in the 3rd section of the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible. Did I get that one right? Tanakh. All right, I added an A. The Tanakh. Oh yeah, I'm not going to be doing that one. We don't have the sign up here, the splash zone, so I won't be doing that. The Tanakh. Often when this reading occurs, the audience is encouraged to participate by making happy noises when the hero or the heroine show up and are mentioned. And then likewise booing at the point when Haman's name would be mentioned. So that's sometimes, how it's done. So it has a serious impact, right? If you've just read all that we read about the killing and everything that happened. But in celebration mode, this is the way that it's been carried out, to celebrate. And of course, that's how you get this to be passed on to a younger generation, is it not? Teachers would know. You get the young people involved. They participated in a fun way, right? By recreating the story and booing when Haman's there, and right? And then as they grow older, they get the details of the story and what it's there for. This is one of the ways that you keep something as a celebration in the minds of a people, is you establish it with their children. A second common theme in the celebration of Purim is the wearing of masks. So like some folks in our culture, we have the Halloween celebration where you put the mask on and nobody knows who you are. Now, we're not talking about Halloween. I'm just saying, if you're trying to look for a celebration that we have that we're familiar with, that would be the closest thing that you could look to. There are some who trace this back as role-playing of the characters when they're telling the story of Esther. So you might have somebody that has a mask and they're the ones that represent Haman. So when the person reading the story talks about what Haman does, then you have a person wearing a mask to show that they're Haman, and then they, reenact it like a play is what it is. So they put their masks on as they reenact the play. There are others, however, who say that the reason for the mask is because it's a disguise, in that this is a picture of how God is not mentioned in the story of Esther, but that he was clearly behind the scenes all the time. In other words, being a cloak of the natural order. So we have called it sovereignty. Even though we don't hear God, we see God. Even though the words are not spoken, we see his protection. We see all of his promises being fulfilled, right? There's a continuation of that. A third common feature in the celebration is delivering gifts to a friend. It's usually food. It is known as the mishloach mano, Hebrew for sending portions to one another. At least 2 foods should be given to represent this, because it's supposed to be plural in its sense. So you wouldn't give a gift of food, you would give at least 2 foods. 2 common foods that are shared during Purim are, I wish I had practiced all of my pronunciation ahead of time. The hamantashen, and the krplash. Did I get that close? Krplash? Hamantashen is a triangular pastry, which is filled. Originally it was done with poppy seeds, and then it moved to like prunes, and now it can be done with any type of jams or nuts or chocolate. And by the way, for those of you who are here today, we have some of those for you to be able to have a taste of. So we are very grateful to have somebody that was an expert. She has a certificate, but she won for doing this. Nothing but the best for you all. The krplash is the Jewish ravioli that's filled with mincemeat, garlic, onion, and spices. So gifts can also be sent to someone who is considered a poorer Jew or a person in need. And again, I would tie that back to the thought that you would never want anybody to be left out of the celebration. Fourth, in celebrating with a festive meal called the Sudah, Jews are to eat and drink and be merry. So the whole point is we're to be festive. This is a celebration that we are to participate in. For some, there can be a day of fasting preceding the celebration of Purim. However, there is to be no fasting on the day of Purim. So that's kind of forbidden now. There's also an acceptance that no eulogies are to be spoken on the day of Purim. So it's clear that anything that could bring sadness is to be avoided. Only things that are to bring joy, and joy to all the Jews, is what is a testimony of this celebration. So as we close, I just want to give you some highlights, for me anyway, some of the lessons that we take away from the book of Esther. God initiates all things to accomplish his will. He's the initiator. We are to be responsive to his prompting like Mordecai and Esther were. God will bring about his will because he alone is sovereign over his creation. We are to be in alignment with that will. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. So Proverbs 3, 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. God will acknowledge the man whom he desires to honor. So if you were here, you remember the chapter in which we talked about that point as it was demonstrated with Haman and Mordecai, with King Ahasuerus, but we tied it to our Father and him being the king who could honor who he chooses to honor. God will protect his people his way. Here in the story of Esther, we're dealing with the Jews, but for those of us that live in this time and in this place, remember that that is there for you as a Christian as well. You are his people. God's word is irrevocable, period. We are to be in a perpetual worship of our God, as done through our lives as a testimony to his goodness, as the celebration of Purim demonstrates to us. So we can talk about the celebration and we can take a personal note to know we are to be in celebration when we talk about this God. God is an active God in the lives of mankind, and he loves us. 1 John chapter 4, verses 15 through 19. 1 John chapter 4, I'll begin in verse 15. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him, and he in God. We have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this, love is perfected with us, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because he is. So also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. We loved because he first loved us. He has not left us alone in this world. So first we establish that he loves us. Well, what do we expect from that love? What is our heart and expectation? And I tell you that he's not left us alone. And guess what? He's coming back. Hebrews chapter 10, we'll do verses 35 through 38. Hebrews 10, beginning in verse 35. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of your God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a little while he is coming, will come, and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. We are not to shrink back. We are filled with his love. We are to be brave in whatever world he has placed us in. My prayer for you is that you know God is your Savior through Jesus Christ, his Son, and that you know this love of God, and that you would have a desire to honor and to serve him with every part of your life. And so I conclude in the book of Luke, chapter 10, verses 27 and 28. So Luke chapter 10, starting in 27. And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. That's the God of Esther, and that's the God of today. And what a privilege that we get to celebrate such a loving God.